Hi, I'm Chris Smith at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and today in my presentation I was using remote sensing to assess burn severity in the Alaska boreal forest. In this presentation, my two study sites were the Shovel Creek Fire and the Nugget Creek Fire, just located outside of Fairbanks. Some background on burn severity was, as I said before, we had two local fires in 2019, the Shovel Creek and the Nugget Creek Fire, which provided a great opportunity to assess burn severity due to their easy road accessibility. The Shovel Creek Fire cost about $25 million to fight, and the Nugget Creek Fire cost about $50,000 to fight. And burn severity has to be assessed within an 18 to 24 month window, so realistically in Alaska you only have about the following summer to assess burn severity. And data availability and techniques have been improved since burn severity in the boreal forest was last studied. In this study we used multispectral satellite imagery called Sentinel-2, and we also collected 30-meter circular modified composite burn index plots, or CBI plots, to assess burn severity, and they do that by measuring the amounts of change that happened after the fire event. We collected 52 plots at Shovel Creek and 28 plots at Nugget Creek, and you can see the map where we collected those points down below. So there are two routes that you can go to create a burn severity map. There's the traditional indice route, and then there is the machine learning classifiers. So the traditional indices, like the normalized burn ratio, or the NBR, and the NDVI, are normalized difference vegetation index, are indices that use the formulas down below, and each of those variables is a different band of light that is being used in the formula. And then we have the DNDVI and the DNBR, which take the pre-fire indice and then subtract it from the post-fire indice, and it gives you the difference in the amounts of change between the two scenes. And then from that, we're able to generate a burn severity map using a line of best fit. And then we run a correlation assessment to see if these indices are actually correlated with an increase in the composite burn index. And we do that by using our 30 by 30 meter CBI plots, and then we conduct our accuracy assessment. The second route that you can go is using the machine learning classifiers, and the two that we used in this study were the random forest and the support vector machine. And what you do is you give it your training data. So in this case, it was our 30 by 30 meter CBI plots. And what you're saying is, I know it is at this location. So for example, I have a high burn severity plot here. Now find everything that looks similar to it, and it does that for each of these classes, and it's going to generate us a burn severity map. And then once again, we're going to do an accuracy assessment, and we use our 30 by 30 meter plots, and then ultimately we're going to compare the products at the end. The first supervised classifier I'm going to talk about is the support vector machine. So what it's doing is it's trying to find the best hyperplane line to separate these two classes. So in the first case, it's just a straight line through the data, and it's able to separate it into class 1 and class 2. In the second example, it's creating a circle around the data to separate class 1 from class 2. And it gets more complex when you add different dimensions and you start adding in more classes that you're trying to classify. So the random forest classifier is using decision trees to help classify the pixels. So a basic example of this is we have three animals. We have a squirrel, a dog, and a lion, and we want to separate these three animals from each other. So to do this, we come up with a decision tree. So the first one was, does the animal eat meat? If the answer is no, then we have a squirrel. And then if it's yes, then we have two animals that still eat meat, so we have to break them down further. So does the animal bark is a question we ask. If the answer is no, then we have a lion. If the answer is yes, then we have a dog. Now looking at some of the results from Shovel Creek, so here we had the machine learning classifiers outperforming all of the traditional indices, and the support vector machine and the random forest had an 83% accuracy. And then we had our MBR and our delta MBR have the same accuracy at 73%, and then the NDVI had a 65% accuracy, while the DNDVI had a 60% accuracy. And then now if you look at the results from Nugget Creek, we're seeing something a little bit different. Our NDVI had a 96% accuracy, while our DMBR had an 89% accuracy. Our first machine learning classifier was the random forest with a 78% accuracy, and then it was followed by our MBR with a 75% accuracy, our DNDVI with a 71% accuracy, and then our least accurate product was the machine learning support vector machine with a 67% accuracy. So the big key findings from this research is that both the machine learning classifiers and spectral indices have the ability to accurately assess burn severity. For the Nugget Creek site, our NDVI outperformed all products, including the machine learning classifiers and the delta indices. So the reason that we're thinking that these results are occurring is that the machine learning classifier is performing better when we have a larger amount of training data. While when field data is limited, these spectral indices can outperform the supervised classifiers. And moving forward, we're hoping to look at burn severity and its relationship to different fire field characteristics, and are hoping to create a wildfire hazard map for the Fairbanks area. Thank you.
Howdy everyone, my name is Joshua Knicely. I am a Ph.D. candidate here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, working in the Geophysical Institute. Most of my work is about studying Venus, and I'd like to share that with you all today. This has been a huge collaborative effort. I've got my 4 co-authors here, Richard Lynch with Goddard and Heliospace, Larry Matthews with Jet Propulsion Laboratory, we have Marty Gilmore with Wesleyan University, and Robbie Herrick here at UAF. But more than that, we also have the Venus Flagship Mission Concept Study Team. This was a huge team effort. A lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today came out of the 2020 Venus Flagship Mission Study. This is a concept study that NASA does every decade or so for each of the planets, Venus included. It's a conceptual exercise that NASA uses to plan their future missions. The idea is we get a bunch of scientists and engineers together and we all plan our dream mission, the thing that we really want to do, something that's going to change the way that we see the universe. And that's where the flagship mission class comes in. That's the highest rated mission class. Generally, they're about $1 billion or more. Really expensive, but again, these are the missions that really change how we see the universe. Some good examples are the Voyager missions. It's like our first survey of our solar system. We had Galileo going to the Jovian system to look at Jupiter and some of its moons. Then we had Cassini going to Saturn. And right now, we have Curiosity rover on Mars. About the VFM team, we had a whole bunch of people working on this. We had 15 scientists, myself included, another 42 engineers, a bunch of people, and then dozens of people in our acknowledgements that contributed little bits of work to help us do this. And not only that, but we also had hundreds of thousands of other people whose work that we cited, all those references. This is something that we all did together. This is a gigantic team effort. For those of us that would like to learn more, I advise checking out the finalized version of the Venus Flagship Mission Concept Study Report. It's in that URL right there. I will warn, it's a bit of a detailed read, pretty heavy. If you have questions, contact a scientist. I can't speak for all scientists, but the majority of us love talking about our work. We love sharing about the science and helping other people understand it and why it matters. As a kid, I grew up watching lots of science fiction and learning shows with my family. Monday nights after dinner, we'd get together and watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. Later on Thursdays, it became Voyager. And pretty much any night that we had free, we'd sit down and watch PBS, especially Nova. I loved these shows. I still love these shows. They call on us to be our better selves, to explore and expand our knowledge. And my parents really supported that. They nourished that desire to understand, to push past the comfort of what I knew in order to learn something new. And that's why I want to learn more about Venus, because it is a confusing planet. So Venus should be very Earth-like. We've got a similar mass, similar volume, and as far as we can tell, it has a similar chemical composition. And when we look at computer modeling of the physics of our universe, that suggests these planets were even more similar in the past. Venus likely had liquid water on its surface for a good chunk of its history, up to about 1 billion years ago, as well as the conditions necessary for DNA-based life like you and I, life like us. But wow, are the surfaces different. We've got an atmosphere that's almost pure carbon dioxide and incredibly dense. a surface temperature of 735 Kelvin or 840 degrees Fahrenheit. That is crazy hot. And we have volcanoes that are hundreds of times wider than anything on Earth that could swallow up any of the states in the lower 48, but are also so flat that we might not notice walking on them. Why is that? This is weird. This is not a normal thing. And this is where I'd like to propose something. Let's do something hard. Let's challenge ourselves to figure out why these two planets are so different by going to Venus. And more specifically, let's go to the tesserae. Now, this will not be an easy thing to do. This is a huge challenge. But before we dismiss the idea, let's ask ourselves two questions. What are the tesserae? And why would learning about them matter? Then let's decide if it's crazy to try. What are the tesserae? The tesserae are these highly tectonized terrains unique to Venus. If we look at the map in the bottom left corner, they're the highlighted regions in that beige color. Now, these are places where the forces, or geodynamic forces, have squeezed and twisted and turned and just messed with these terrains and scrunched them up together. They show up as comparatively bright regions in our radar imagery. If we look at that radar image in the top right, we see these kind of dark gray parts. That's the intertessera fill. That's going to be either sediments or more likely lavas that have just piled up in those low-lying regions. And then we have these really bright regions here. And these are the tesserae. The tesserae are the oldest portions of Venus. And this is a really important thing to remember. The vast majority of Venus is covered by volcanic plains that we think were formed in the last billion years or so. Meaning any history those volcanic plains would record is only from that last billion years. If we want to learn anything further in the past, if we want to get information from deeper in the past, we have to look at the rocks that were there at the time, meaning we have to look at the tesserae. So that's what the tesserae are, but why would they matter? Every scientist will say something different. After all, none of us are exactly alike. There are really two reasons for me. First, I want to understand how plate tectonics started on Earth. Plate tectonics is one of the foundational theories of geology. It describes how the Earth's surface deforms and recycles itself. It's really important for understanding how the Earth changes, and it may be important in terms of the genesis of life. Earth is the only known instance of it. We don't know anywhere else where plate tectonics has happened. But the weird thing is that Earth has plate tectonics, whereas Venus, a planet that is, by and large, broadly similar to Earth, does not, which is weird. What is so different about these two planets that cause them to have such drastically different geodynamic regimes? Well, now we start getting into the second reason, and that has to do with habitability. Venus may have once been a habitable planet similar to Earth. I heard Dr. Gyada Arni speaking at a conference several years ago. She referred to Venus as the once and future Earth. We know Venus has lost a lot of water thanks to isotopic ratios. We know the sun was fainter in the past. Combined climate and solar modeling tell us that Venus should have had the conditions not only for liquid water on its surface, but conditions that were also favorable to DNA-based life, life like us. So 2 billion years ago, Venus may have looked like Earth does today. Personally, I find those two reasons fantastically convincing in terms of let's go to Venus. Let's just do it. It's amazing. Let's learn about this. But before I can let that excitement take over, we have to look at some of our difficulties, some of the things that are going to get in the way. One of the first ones has to deal with pressure. The Venusian atmosphere is incredibly thick and incredibly dense. And once we get down to the surface, it's akin to being about 1 kilometer underneath the ocean, which is difficult and something we have to deal with, but it isn't a huge problem. It messes with the way that rockets work. Rocket bells are designed for very particular ambient conditions. They're designed to work in a very particular atmosphere. That's why most rockets on Earth are 2 stages. There's the first stage, which is for sea level, and then there's the second stage, which is for in vacuum. Surface pressure is one of the big things we're going to have to deal with. It's equivalent to being 1 kilometer deep in the ocean. This isn't a big issue, but it does make using conventional rockets for guiding a lander to the tesserae really difficult. Rocket bells are optimized for a very particular ambient atmospheric pressure. So if we take a rocket and try to fire it in the atmosphere of Venus, it may not work very well. Our next big thing is sulfuric acid. The Venusian atmosphere has a lot of sulfuric acid, which can be a problem for long-lived exploration. This is going to destroy any exposed electronics and communications equipment. But, like with pressure, this isn't a huge deal. We have lots of ways around this. Really, our first big major obstacle has to do with heat, the temperature of Venus. Surface temperatures are around 735 Kelvin or 840 degrees Fahrenheit. That is crazy hot. That's almost 300 degrees hotter than my oven can get. This means we need either insane cooling capabilities, insane refrigeration technology, or we need a new form of electronics that can withstand these high temperatures. NASA is working on both of these with something called the Hot Operating Temperature Technology Program, also known as HOT-TECH. We've made some major strides. In the VFM, our engineers used a phase-change material to keep the electronics cool. It's basically like sweating, but for robots. We have a fluid in a dry environment. It gets warm. As it gets warm, it evaporates. And when it evaporates, it takes away heat. And that's how it keeps that part cool. We also have some simple sensors that can survive and operate in these temperatures for months. But we have a way to go before we can get a system that can use sophisticated electronics on the surface. One of our next big issues is unknown surface roughness. We can't guide exactly where the lander goes because of the winds in the Venusian atmosphere. So anything we send has to survive on its own. It's got to be able to pilot or just not care about where it hits. From what we can see of the tesserae, they're pretty rough, but we don't know how rough. We have this gigantic gap in our knowledge about the surface roughness. We have surface roughness information at a really small scale, about 10 centimeters or about half a foot. Then we have it at about 100 meters or 330 feet, and then at about 1 kilometer or larger. The problem is our lander sits right here in this range. This is the information that we need, and that is the exact gap that we have. So anything we send has to be indifferent to the surface or be able to guide itself to a location with a high science value and a low hazard value. If we go with a lander that can pilot itself, we need something that pilots both towards science targets and away from hazards. It's simply not enough to go someplace safe. If all we're worried about is staying safe, we can just stay in our rooms. Our last big issue is visibility. In order to guide itself, our lander has to sense the surface. In this case, that means looking at it with a camera and lasers. For those of us that have lived in Fairbanks for a while, we've seen ice fog and snow and lots of other things affecting visibility, like in the picture on the right. My wife, Jen, and I were driving out last weekend, and visibility was terrible. We had to drive well below the speed limit because we couldn't see hazards far enough away. And it seemed like a perfect rendition of Venus, except it'd be a little bit more yellow, like in the picture in the center. But we can do this. This all sounds really hard to do, but despite all these issues, we have the technology we need to vastly increase our knowledge of Venus. We have Teflon coatings to protect against the sulfuric acid. We have artificial intelligences that can successfully pilot towards science and away from hazards. We even have some simplistic electronics that can operate in these extreme conditions, like Lizzie, the long-lived in situ surface explorer. And we also have some crazy things like these tensegrity devices that are completely indifferent to orientation. We have the opportunity right now to vastly increase our knowledge of Venus. And by doing so, we're going to learn more about the Earth and the thousands and thousands of exoplanets that we've discovered just in our local neighborhood of the galaxy. We can learn about where other places might have life. That's my presentation. I hope we all learned something new today. What questions do we have?
Hi, my name is Skye Kushner, and I'm a Ph.D. student over here at the GI, working with the Alaska Volcano Observatory. And I'm here to talk to you today about monitoring Aleutian Island volcanic activity using really high-frequency gas detection methods. So one of the really cool things about working in Alaska and being allowed to use this state as a natural laboratory is the sheer amount of volcanoes here compared to anywhere else in the United States. Not a lot of people in the lower 48 realize this, not a lot of people in Alaska realize this, but we actually have 54 historically active volcanoes in the state itself, stretching largely along the Aleutian Islands and also sort of heading up into the mainland itself. So a historically active volcano is just something that's erupted within the last 200 years. The main one that I'll be talking about today is Cleveland, that little dot over there. So currently, the Alaska Volcano Observatory tries to monitor as many of these volcanoes as is possible using color codes between green to red. This is just a screenshot from the website earlier on today showing which volcanoes are not erupting, the ones in green, and one that was just switched over to yellow, Semi-Sapochnoi, earlier on yesterday. This is a publicly available website, and everyone can feel free to look at what volcanic activity is currently happening at avo.alaska.edu. So how do we look at these volcanoes in specific? So one of the great things about working at the Alaska Volcano Observatory, for me at least, has been the interdisciplinary nature of the program. So we bring together a lot of different people with different backgrounds, including geology and physics and chemistry, to work together to try to forecast eruptions and monitor the behavior of volcanoes that were sort of highlighted in the previous slide. We use a couple of different techniques to do this, including seismometers over here, but also GPS stations and remote sensing through satellite observations to monitor inflation or deflation of volcanoes, which can be things that will happen before an eruption. A lot of these techniques are currently set up at huts to make their measurements and send their data back to us at our places, at our offices in the mainland, in order to record them down and sort of note any of these changes. Gas measurements, on the other hand, are a little more difficult for us right now. Because these volcanoes are remote, we can't go there once every day or once every week. We can only really visit them to perform our measurements, which are usually done on top of a plane or ground-based using techniques that we'll cover later on, once every year. That poses problems when some of the techniques that we use aren't specifically applicable at some volcanoes. So there are a couple of volcanoes that we have down the arc that don't necessarily have precursory deformation or ground vibrations in the form of earthquakes before an eruption happens, or at the very least at a time scale that is relevant for our ability to say to the community at large, okay, we're slightly worried that an eruption might happen here. Cleveland, the volcano that I'll be talking about, is one of those areas, which brings us to gas geochemistry. We can use gases to forecast eruptions because of some pretty simple underlying chemistry. Generally, gases under pressure prefer to be dissolved in liquids. We can see this every day at home whenever we open up a can of soda. The pressure is released and the dissolved gases inside come out in the form of little bubbles. Now, the same is generally true with magmas. We have a lot of gases that are dissolved inside of them, which are then under the immense amount of pressure of tens to hundreds of kilometers of overlying rock. So as the magma rises up through the rock, the pressure is released and certain gases start to escape at different levels. This is visible with CO2 in deep crust, SO2 and other sulfur species in mid-crust range, water in shallow crust, and other halogen gases at higher crustal levels. So one signal that we might be able to use as volcanologists is if we're monitoring the gases or a specific gas species that comes out of a volcano and we suddenly see a larger amount of it, then that could be an indication that the magma is rising up and a certain species of gas has started to dissolve or separate at that level. This is generally a pretty good sign that new magma has entered a system and can sometimes be used to forecast eruptions. But conversely, if magma gets hardened at the top of a volcano, gas can be stopped from leaving, which will lead to a decrease in the total gas emitted and a buildup of pressure. This can also be interpreted as a precursory sign of an eruption. So this brings us to our plan, which is to set up a permanent gas instrumentation known as a DOAS instrument, pictured here, on Cleveland Volcano at 2 different stations. Currently, when we measure gas on an annual basis, if you'll think back, we can monitor long-term trends. However, if we throw these instruments permanently at the volcano, then we'll be able to take a measurement every, give or take, 10 minutes. This will allow us to figure out on a very constant basis how much SO2 is coming out of Cleveland in terms of tons per day emission. This is generally when the volcano is not active, between 100 to 200 tons of SO2 a day, so quite a large amount. So this technique works by scanning through the volcanic plume to measure the absorption of sunlight by SO2 in the plume itself. This technique works very well for SO2 specifically because while it's a present species in the plume, it's not something that occurs naturally in large concentrations in our atmosphere, unlike other gases emitted by the volcano, including carbon dioxide and water. So if we look under specific wavelengths or bands for sulfur dioxide, where we know the gases are absorbed, we're actually able to quantify the total amount of molecules of sulfur dioxide that are present in this column. Which brings us to Cleveland Volcano. This is a specifically interesting target for us at the Alaska Volcano Observatory because of the large amount of historic eruptions that have happened at this site. Specifically, there's 20 to 22 noted historic eruptions that have happened within the last 200 years and it continues to happen today. The most recent one, of course, being June 1st in 2020. However, there have also been fairly notable large ones in 2006, 2001, and 1994. There's pictured down here is a timeline of all of these eruptions going back to 1975. You can see even in recent memory, there's been quite a lot. Every red dot is an eruption. And then the actual volcano itself, Cleveland, looks like this. It's fairly symmetrical. This is it on a good day. As you can see, there's still a large visible amount of gases coming off of the top of it. And then during explosions, Cleveland looks like this. This picture itself was taken during 2006 from the International Space Station. As you can see, there's a large cloud of ash and other gases coming off of it. So what would a precursory signal here look like? It could either look like this, which is a picture of Cleveland following an eruption where large amounts of gases were coming off of it, or it could look like this picture on the bottom, which is Cleveland shortly before an eruption, in which we have a dome feature plugging up the release of gases. So if you'll think back, we might, in some circumstances, have an increase in the amount of SO2 that comes off of it, or in others, we might have a decrease. The only way we'll be able to know and predict using these patterns is by having a large enough baseline for the volcano and making enough measurements over the series of days to weeks to years. Ideally, once we have a number of measurements and patterns up for Cleveland, we'll be able to apply this to other volcanoes in the Aleutians, or maybe prove that we can use the same type of gas instrumentation at other target volcanoes. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Hi, my name is Valerie and I'm a PhD student with the Alaska Volcano Observatory at the Geophysical Institute at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Today I'm going to talk to you about volcanic gases at magma storage depth. My area of study is Augustine Volcano and Cook Inlet. So Skye talked to you before about volcanic gases and how we can use them for volcano monitoring purposes. We mostly study water, H2O, sulfur dioxide, SO2, and carbon dioxide, CO2. However, water is really hard to measure in the atmosphere because of the high background levels of water vapor in the air. Gases at storage depth, so in a magma chamber of 4 kilometers or deeper, are sometimes kind of weird, and they can either be dissolved or exsolved. So dissolved means that the gases are in the fluid. They're part of the fluid and you can't actually see them. So it's kind of like in a Coke bottle where you can't actually see the gases. They're within the liquid. However, we all know that if we open a soda bottle, we suddenly get bubbles. And the gases are now exsolved, meaning they are separate from the fluid. They make bubbles. So in a magma chamber, we have pretty much the same thing. We have gases that are within the melt. We can't see them. But we also have gases exsolved in bubbles. So like I said, I'm studying gases at 4 kilometers or deeper. It's not necessarily straightforward how we can actually study them. So one way is to look at surface gas emission data. Since all of the gases that were once emitted at the surface had to be at storage depth in the magma chamber somewhere. So we can use that as a proxy for the total gas budget in a volcano. The other way is we can use melt inclusions. So here you have an image of a couple of crystals, and those black dots are melt inclusion. You have here a little scale. The black bar is 0.2 millimeters, or about a tenth of an inch. So those black points, like I said, those are melt inclusions, meaning that a crystal grew in a magma chamber and surrounded a droplet of magma. And this droplet of magma stayed at the same composition and still represents the magma conditions, so the pressure and temperature conditions that existed in the magma chamber. So we use those melt inclusions and study their composition and the gases that are dissolved in them, meaning they're in the liquid and we can't see them, to study how the gases were at depth. Finally, we can also use experimental data, meaning volcanologists, they conduct experiments. So they put a tiny rock under pressure and temperature conditions similar to that in a magma chamber, and we see what happens to them. So in my study, we mostly focus on the two first points. Why is it important to study volcanic gases at depth? Well, they are the driver of an eruption. So we all know if you shake up a soda bottle and then open it, all the gases exsolve, meaning, again, they're forming bubbles. Those bubbles then expand, foam up, and make a messy fountain. Volcanoes kind of make the same mess. So bubbles exsolve, they rapidly expand, and an explosion happens. And you can still see from the rock here the foamy texture that occurred, similar to the Coke bottle experiment, where magma foams up and then solidifies. The other important point why it's important to study gas at depth is because gases make magma compressible. So compressibility is, imagine if you blow up a balloon with air and you can press on it and the volume gets smaller. That's compressibility. So if a magma is compressible, that has really important effects on how we interpret volcano monitoring data. So for example, we use GPS data and monitor how the edifice of a volcano looks like. So here you have a volcano at rest with a small magma chamber in the middle. Now before a volcano erupts, more magma goes into the magma chamber and the edifice of the volcano literally balloons up. So we can measure with GPS data how big the volcano expands. However, if now there is gas in the magma chamber, then the magma chamber becomes compressible. And that means that we can't see the full extent of how much magma came into the magma chamber and how much the volcano ballooned up. So therefore, it's really important to figure that out, because then finally at the end, the eruption is going to be a lot bigger than we expected, because the compressibility of the magma hits the full extent of that expansion. So like I said, in my study, we look at Augustine volcano. Augustine is in the Cook Inlet, like I said, and it had its last big eruption in 2006. Some of you might even remember that eruption because it actually deposited ash in Homer and several other communities nearby. So what we did in our study is we did some interdisciplinary modeling, which sounds a bit complicated, but what we mainly did is we looked at how much gas came out of the volcano, and we looked at melt inclusions. And then we calculated how much gas can be exsolved or in bubbles in the magma chamber. And we found that about 5 volume% of the entire magma chamber were bubbles, not crystals and not melt. And we were also able to calculate how much water was in those bubbles. And like I said, it's really hard to measure water in the atmosphere. So that gives us a really novel approach to estimate how much water actually was in a volcano. And that's really important because water makes up a lot of the gas in a volcano. We were also able to calculate the magma compressibility. And like I said, an eruption size is underestimated if we don't account for magma compressibility. And in the case of Augustine eruption, the eruption was actually 3 times larger than shown by deformation. So based on the deformation data, we would have expected that about 25 million cubic meters, or about the volume of 25 Empire State Buildings, should have erupted. But the actual eruption was almost 3 times larger, so in reality, 72 Empire State Buildings got erupted. So what are we doing for the future? Right now, we did that retrospectively. So we looked back at an eruption and looked if we could calculate magma compressibility and see if it coincides with the data that we have from that eruption. And what we're trying to do now is looking if we can actually try and estimate the eruption size, including the compressibility in real near time. So if a new eruption occurs, can we actually estimate the eruption size while the eruption is still ongoing? And that, of course, has really important implications for volcano monitoring purposes. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, my name is Josianne Haag, and I am a graduate student at the College of Fisheries and Ocean Science at UAF. And today I'm going to be presenting my project, which is characterizing groundwater in Kachemak Bay using naturally occurring isotopes. So why am I studying groundwater? Well, groundwater is an important source of nutrients. So nutrients are important in our marine coastal ecosystems because they basically fuel our food webs. And one of the main sources we think about when we think of nutrients is rivers. However, groundwater flux can actually be a lot greater than rivers in some locations. The reason why we don't consider groundwater a lot of the time in our models is because groundwater is really tricky to measure. So when I talk about groundwater, especially in Alaska, so you can see my red square is my study site, Kachemak Bay. And groundwater is really important here, or can potentially be a really important source of nutrients. Because when I talk about groundwater, there's that fresh water that's kind of going through the sediments and then out into our coastal ecosystem. However, there's another source of groundwater that's controlled through tidal pumping. So when we go into a high tide, that water is being pushed into the sediment, that salt water, and then in low tide, it comes back downstream, being drawn back out into the ocean, and that is our more saline source of groundwater. So Kachemak Bay and Southeast Alaska has some of the largest tidal variations or tidal ranges in the world, so potentially this tidal pumping is a really important mechanism. So my study site is Kachemak Bay. Here it is, a little bit bigger. And so Kachemak Bay is a really complex ecosystem because there's a lot of rivers feeding into the bay. Some of them more or less glaciated in their watersheds. There's mud flats. There's lots going on. So what I do is I also use a smaller study site, and that's in blue, and that's Jackaloff Bay. And it's a lot simpler because there's one river at the head of the bay, and then there's mud flats as well, and then it's just simple out. So I can use this to test a lot of my methods to figure out if I'm properly studying this area. So how am I going to be studying this? It's difficult to measure. Well, I'm going to be using radium and radon isotopes as tracers of groundwater. So radon and radium, these two different elements, have well-defined sources, so everything about them I can quantify. So radium and radon enter the ecosystem through land-ocean boundaries. So estuaries, rivers, and groundwater, as well as our sediment pore water. And the reason I'm not looking straight at nutrients, for example, since that's what I care about, right? I want to think about how groundwater is impacting food webs, but I can't look at nutrients because as soon as it goes into the water, it's being used up by all the biology living there. So we need to use something that is biologically inert. Basically, biology ignores both radium and radon. So they're only removed from the system through decay or mixing. So they can mix with less concentrated offshore waters, or in particular radon, since it's a gas, it can go into the atmosphere and be lost that way. So those are also losses, sinks that I can quantify, that are measurable. So when I measure radon, so you can see here, this is how I set it up. So we have a pump in the water, and so it pumps water continuously through my equipment, and then the radon detector is going to get a concentration or activity of radon over a period of time. So I'm about to show you a graph. Don't freak out, I'll explain what I'm doing with it. A lot's going on. So red is my radon. So you can see that our radon is fluctuating over time, and it's fluctuating in a way that's kind of on the same time scale as our tides, which is in blue. So this kind of tells me that the radon is varying closely with changes in tide, and this goes back to my idea that the tides are controlling a lot of the groundwater input in Kachemak Bay. This was only done over a few days, so it's not real. It doesn't show a very clear relationship yet, but I'm going to be doing it again this summer for a longer period of time. So hopefully I can kind of tease out that relationship a bit better. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is radium. So radium, we take discrete samples, not continuous, and I have to take over 100 liters per sample because the activity of radium in the water is so low. So you can see I put my samples in garbage cans, and then that's not even enough, so I need to fill carboys, and then I dump them in as the water is being filtered through these cartridges. So there's cartridges filled with a fiber, and as the radium passes through that fiber, it basically sticks. So then I can take my cartridge, bring it back to the lab, stick it on my machine, and it'll tell me the counts, but then I'll make that into an activity or a concentration of radium in the water. And then you can see on the bottom, there's me and my advisor, Dr. William Burt, and we were being dropped off for our river sampling. So we have our backpacks on with all of our equipment, and if we're lucky, we get dropped off right on shore. If we're not as lucky, we have to wade in, but honestly, that's kind of more fun. So we have to wade in, it's up to the water's up to our knees, mid-thigh kind of thing. I really enjoy it. So the really cool thing about radium is it also gives us more information. So we can look at water flushing time. So when I'm talking about water flushing time, it's essentially how long does it take for a parcel of water to make it through a body of water. So if we're looking at a bay, and imagine we have an oil spill at the head of the bay. So I'm looking at how long does it take that oil to leave the bay. And you can kind of get a sense of why this is important. Because for example, if we have nutrients being introduced at the head of the bay, we want to know how long it might take it for it to leave the bay. So in Jackaloff, how long those nutrients being introduced how long it'll take before it gets into Kachemak Bay, right? So that kind of connectivity. So we can do this by splitting our body of water into different sections. And our radium decays, right? So it becomes a different element over time. And there's different types of radium, so those are isotopes. So I look at 223 and 224, those are the shorter lived ones. And so both of them decay, but they decay at different rates. So because as soon as the radium's inputted into the ocean, it's being diluted. But because both my radium 223 and 224 are diluted the same way, I can use the fraction of radium 223 to 224, that ratio, and I can see as time goes on how that changes. And because I know the decay rate of these radium isotopes, I can figure out how long it's been since that parcel of water left my land-ocean boundary. So I'm just going to show you a quick example of how I use some of my radium data to think about groundwater. So we have Kachemak Bay. So the white is the water, the gray is the land. And so my red box is at the mouth of the bay. And we did a transect across. So we took samples across. And so from other oceanographic data, from other researchers, we know that the water enters the bay along the south shore and exits along the north shore. And from our radium data, we see that there's an enrichment of radium in the bay. So where is this enrichment coming from, right? Because that's our idea of the enrichment's coming from this land-ocean boundary where, you know, there's some sort of input. So we want to know where it's coming from. So I measured some rivers. So I measured Jackaloff, the Oise, and Growing, and you can see I've written them on the map as well, different amounts of glaciation in their watersheds. However, the activities from these rivers is not enough to account for that enrichment. So we have to come up with another hypothesis. So this summer, the enrichment that we found, since it's not from the rivers, might be groundwater. So this summer I've come up with a hypothesis that it's from the head of the bay. So what I've circled here is the head of the bay where there's actually some extensive mudflats. So I think that these mudflats are a major source of enrichment. We have that big tidal pumping that I was talking about earlier. So by using radium data, you can kind of solve for different things and figure out where groundwater might be coming into an ecosystem. So thank you for listening, and I'll answer any questions you have.